Welcome to the Conversation Lab. I'm Don Schaefer. This past weekend, I found myself in several circular conversations that really didn't go anywhere other than leaving me frustrated. Whether about war, truckers, or vaccines, a little voice inside my head said, just walk away. And that's when I remembered a conversation that I'd had with Jim Hoggan a few years ago, and I thought I might share it. Remember, parts of it are a little dated, but still very relevant with the discussions occurring today. Jim Hoggan is one of Canada's most respected public relation advisors. He's a past chair of the David Suzuki Foundation and founder of the website Smog blog to expose misinformation campaigns polluting the public debate around climate change. He's written 3 books on the topic of integrity in public communication. His most recent, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, The Toxic State of Public Discourse and How to Clean It Up. And we were just talking over coffee. Who are you? You're a public relations guy, and I was introduced to you by Sephora Berman. And first time you'd come on my radar screen, and now I'm deeply into 2 of your books. You do a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of an accidental activist. Something I'd actually...
Aren't we all?
In some ways, I think, it's very odd that, I'm a corporate public relations consultant.
So that's your background.
That's my background. I ran the most successful PR firm in Vancouver for about 20 years. And and I've come to believe that there's too much public relations in the world and not enough communications. And
so explain the difference, like drill down on both sides of that argument.
Well, everyone knows that we think of public relations as spin, right?
Yeah. Okay.
The idea that you're trying to characterize something that's maybe not as good as you'd like it to be, maybe reputationally damaging as something that's better than it actually is. Most of the time, it's fairly innocent, and most communications people struggle to, toe the line and be truthful. They want to be honest, but when you deal with, when your client is the tobacco industry or your client is the oil and gas industries, and you have a client whose product is actually warming the planet, it's hard to be straight, and some people veer off in a much more aggressive direction. And when I came up in the public relations business, I ran into a lot of people who I didn't want to do business with, and the people that I had about in our prime maybe 25 people in my office, most of whom were ex-journalists, and there's a kind of public-mindedness about journalists who. So I had to, in order to manage the team, we were always kind of looking at the public good and what we were doing and so on. And we developed a kind of an ethos in a culture where my approach to public relations was, if you don't want people thinking you're an SOB, then the first step is to not be an SOB. And that the best process or the best strategy for good public relations and a good reputation is, first do the right thing. Next, be seen to be doing the right thing. And don't be getting those 2 things mixed up.
Mm-hmm. It seems simple.
It's simple, and I think in most situations it works very well. But when you get into these really rough, controversial industries, that's not really you can't do that. And so for me, I think that so many of these rough industries, these industries that have big problems, they have gotten themselves into the business of sowing doubt and denial and confusion and propaganda and polarization. And, there's a political PR has kind of invaded the corporate public relations world in these areas.
What would you say the worst examples of that are? Tobacco was one that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think clean coal, the oil sands, there's a lot of really corrupt public relations that's gone on around the oil sands and pipelines, the ethical oil campaign, the attack on environmentalists in 2012 out here, the foreign-funded radicals narrative. In the United States, you look at Michael Mann, who was one of the climate scientists that he was the guy who developed the hockey stick. You know that,
Yep.
and it was a famous image that was used in Inconvenient Truth. You look at that poor guy's history. I mean, the ad hominem attacks on him, and it's frightening the way people in the United States have gone after him, oil and gas people.
Yeah.
And then, there's a very widespread, we started writing about it in Desmog Blog in 2005, these front groups that have been set up to confuse the public about climate change, to convince them that it really wasn't a problem and that environmentalists were just radicals who were exaggerating the problem, that you can't trust Al Gore. And eventually, I think the worst thing that happened was eventually they were able to actually massage partisan meaning into the science of climate change. So climate change became, in the United States, if you want to know whether or not somebody thinks climate change is a serious problem, just ask whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. And that is the main determining factor. Now, I don't know how much you know about science, but that's actually not how science works, right? Science doesn't care whether you're a left of center or right of center. And so when they were able to massage partisan meaning into science, it became something that, this isn't something that people like you and I believe. And if you believe this, you can't be one of us, you must be one of them. When you do that to any subject, whether it's climate change, gun control, vaccines, then you basically end up in this place where open-minded thinking and sensible conversation just exits.
You did some work with, was it Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah, I interviewed him for my new book.
And he speaks to that.
He does. His area is, he looks at sort of moral foundations of the way people see the world, right? And he's interviewed tens of thousands of people around the world to look at what conservative versus liberal values are. And what ends up happening is if you can drive science, or if you can drive an issue into this kind of, he calls it the moral matrix. If you can drive it into a moral matrix, it will be so hard to change someone's mind. You just probably won't be able to do it. Certainly Al Gore is not going to change the mind of most conservatives in the United States.
We're speaking with Jim Hoggan, and geez, I'm just curious. So how do we fix that? How do we change people's minds?
Yeah, well, let me tell you about a conversation I had right early on in the interviews for my book, and it was with a fellow named Dan Kahan, who teaches at Yale Law School. And Yale Law School is very interesting. I went to law school at University of Victoria, and we were very sort of focused on law. But at Yale, they're all focused on law, but also policy and how policies develop and so on. So this guy was not only a law professor, he was also had a PhD in sociology. And he started a group in the United States called the Cultural Cognition Project. And what they do is they look at the polarization of, how is it that people can, in the face of enormous evidence, deny something like climate change? Or how is it they could think that giving people more guns makes a community safer? There's all sorts of evidence that shows that's certainly not true. And yet the evidence, this cultural cognition phenomenon is that it basically, if evidence comes along that contradicts the cultural beliefs of your group, you don't change your cultural beliefs, you change the evidence. You change the evidence to fit the cultural beliefs of your group. And it doesn't matter how much evidence there is. So let's look at climate change just as it's such a good example, right? There probably isn't in our lifetime any other phenomenon that has been studied so thoroughly and has such widespread agreement as climate change. There probably isn't another area of science that has been on the front page of so many newspapers so frequently. So there's this widespread awareness of this problem, massive amounts of evidence, and yet what do you see? You look at public debates over over the last decade, and you often see people who have no science on their side, not even any scientific credentials on their side, winning debates with people who have all the evidence on their side and are some of the leading atmospheric scientists in the world.
So why is that?
Well, a big part of it is this cultural cognition problem. So you end up, and this is also Jonathan Haidt's area, right? It's called also call it my side bias, right? So you see it with Donald Trump, right? He said he could walk out onto Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he wouldn't lose any supporters. That is the essence of my side bias, right? So he may be a liar, but he's my liar. And so when you tribalize an issue, then it's not about the exchange of information. It's not about rational discussion. It's about who's going to win and who's going to lose. You're a liberal. I'm a conservative. And so I'm going to be fighting for my team. So you think of Dan Kahan said to me, imagine a barber in a small town in the Midwest who starts reading Inconvenient Truth or starts to understand that climate change really is a problem. If he starts talking to his customers, his conservative customers, he's going to really cause some problems for himself socially because of the beliefs of that group, and then also financially. And so people have big incentives to not go against the belief system of their group. It's a tribe against tribe. It's not huge evidence against little evidence. It's not that. So the people on the other side of these debates are not idiots. They have a different belief system. They are actually having a totally different conversation with you. They think you're a liberal who's basically trying to fill the world with regulations and destroy the economy. These are like good people. In Dan Kahan's work, what they found was they thought, okay, well, maybe if people are better educated, you wouldn't see this cultural cognition, this kind of manipulation of information. But what they found is actually worse. The better educated you are, the better you are at kind of rationalizing this sort of process and being able to shut out scientific information that contradicts the views of your group.
What's fascinating about this is that the conversation may have nothing to do with the outcome.
That's right. And so you end up, and so for me, my area is kind of, I'm come at this from an interesting perspective as a corporate PR person over the years. I was on the board of the Urban Development Institute as a vice president for over 20 years. At the same time that I was on the board of the David Suzuki Foundation, it wasn't unusual for me to go from one board meeting where they're talking about crazy environmentalists to another board meeting where you're talking about greedy developers or business people, right? And so I started, and I know all these people, right? I know they're good people, and they're not. So I think we have this problem. There's a kind of an unyielding one-sidedness, and in a way, I look at it and I think, okay, what's worse, denial or self-righteousness? What is the more destructive emotion? When you have a problem like climate change and nothing's being done about it, is it the advocates that are failing to advocate in a way that's persuasive and moves people? Or is it the deniers who are trying to protect business interests or ideology? Yeah. So, and I would say, we're all guilty.
Is there a sweet spot in this conversation where we can pull both sides together? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, I've come to believe, and it's not an easy question to answer, but to go back to Dan Kahan, one of the things he talked about was what he called pluralistic advocacy. And another way of talking about that is or explaining that is leaving in your narrative, in your story, leaving room for other people so they can see themselves on both sides of the issue that you're talking about. If you require not just that we do something about climate change, so we, increase the mileage in cars, or we implement a carbon tax across the country or whatever. If you don't stop at that, but you also want the other side to admit they were wrong, they're totally mistaken about this and apologize for. There's kind of an imperialism that kind of comes with this. People